Well, good morning, everyone. It's time to get started with our class this morning. Our number's a little short this morning, but I do know that we have several of our number that are traveling. We have Elton and Oname both have been exposed to COVID. They're not sick, but they've been exposed, so they thought they better stay in for a few days. I've also heard from some that live in kind of some rougher areas, said their roads are still kind of slick. So I anticipated several not being able to be with us. But if you would be opening your Bibles to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. This morning we're going to begin in verse 57. Matthew chapter 26, verse 57. Don Gillian, would you lead us in prayer to start our class? Amen. Well, we've reached the point in our study of the life of Christ where the mob has come to the garden. They're in the process of arresting Jesus. And we talked last week, concluding our thoughts, about Peter lashing out against the servant of the high priest, cutting off the ear of Malchus. We talked about Jesus' instruction to him to put away his sword, that was not the way that was to be handled, and that he needed to allow these things to transpire. We noticed then at that point, all of these men that had been claiming that they would stay by Jesus' side, that they would not leave him, the text says that they fled away. When Jesus told them, no, I have to be arrested. This has to take place. At that point, verse 56 says, all of the disciples forsook him and fled away. Now remember, just a few hours earlier, each and every one of these men were saying, no, we'll never leave you. No, even if we have to die, we're always going to be by your side. But now, when push has come to shove, when reality has set in, they all have fled away. Now, starting in verse 57, and they that had laid hold on Jesus, meaning those that had come to arrest him, they led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. There in the city of Jerusalem, the high priest had a large residence. It was commonly known as the high priest's palace. And many times this would be where certain official business would be transacted. But here we know this is something that is transpiring in the middle of the night. This is something that is being done without any type of legal sanction whatsoever. But notice, they've all come together. They've assembled there. It tells us that the scribes, meaning the experts in the law, the elders of the people, they've all assembled there at the high priest's house, and they're waiting for this mob to come back with Jesus. Remember, they had conspired with Judas, and Judas had been looking for an opportune time where he could lead them out to arrest Jesus. Well, now that time had come. Jesus was going to the Mount of Olives, going into this garden to pray. Judas knew that only a few people would be there with him. There wouldn't be near the fanfare that would happen if this was to take place within the city. But all of these individuals have come together. They know that Jesus is on the way. They know that some type of decision, some type of action has to be taken immediately before word gets out. Well, in verse 58, notice that Peter, although verse 56 says that all the disciples fled, Peter did flee away. But Peter followed him afar off. Meaning Peter stayed, I look at this as within eye shot. Just close enough that he could see what was going on. Now, he didn't want to be close enough that he would be seen as an associate of Jesus, but he wanted to be there to see what was taking place. So Peter, he follows afar off unto the high priest's palace, or unto the high priest's court. And he went in and he sat with the servants so that he could see to the end. So he goes in and he sits in what we might call today the gallery. He sits there watching all of these things transpire because he wants to know what's going to happen to Jesus. The King James Version says that he sits with the servants. The American Standard says he sits with the officers. So these would have been those that were serving in some type of manner the high priest or those other individuals that had assembled on that day. They were ones that had some form of authority within the Jewish court system. So Jesus goes in and Peter goes in and he sits down with them because he wants to see what's going to take place. Well, 59 says, Now the chief priests and the elders and all of the council sought false witnesses against Jesus to put him to death. Well, we've seen this whole week leading up to this point. They've been trying to find some type of charges that they could bring against Jesus. They tried 3 different ways, and we've talked about that quite in depth, so we won't go back into that again. They tried 3 different ways, 3 different tactics to get Jesus to say something or do something that they could misconstrue into some kind of charges against him. Well, of course, Jesus knew what they were doing, and he was not going to allow himself to fall prey to the things that they were trying to do. And so now that they finally have Jesus arrested, I can imagine they're looking at each other and they're thinking, okay, now how are we going to get this to stick? How are we going to find some type of charge that we can lay to this man when up to this point we've not been able to find anything? There's nothing in this man's character. There's nothing in his practices. There's nothing in his belief system that we can use to charge him with blasphemy. There's not even anything he's doing that we can bring as a charge with the Romans against him. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got to come up with false witnesses. We've got to come up with some people that are willing to speak out against Jesus and say that he's done something wrong, that they saw or heard him do something that was contrary to the law. But notice, from the outset, their intention was not just to punish Jesus in some way. From the outset, they knew that they had to find false witnesses that would give such a powerful testimony against Jesus that it would warrant a death sentence. But notice verse 60. But they found none. They tried to find someone that was willing to say that Jesus had done something questionable, that he had said something contrary. No. No one was willing to step forward. It says, though many false witnesses came, yet found they none. At the last came 2 false witnesses. So there were people that came and they were saying things, but one of the sources that I looked at said oftentimes people would come and they would be compensated for their services to the court. And so people would come and they would want to be these false witnesses. and so that they could get money from the courts. But oftentimes, they would come up with such outlandish charges and outlandish things that they knew that it was something that wouldn't stick, knew that it was something that they couldn't lay to that person's charge. So you have these people that are used to serving in this capacity, which shows just the sheer corruption that was already there in this system. They've come forward. None of them are found worthy by the Jewish leaders to be these witnesses. But then finally, there were two who came forward. And they said, "This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and to build it in 3 days." Did Jesus ever say that? Well, not in the context that they were presenting it. The way they were presenting it, they were saying, Jesus says that he can tear down this whole great structure that's here and that he can build it back up in 3 days. Well, of course, we understand that was not the context of that statement. The high priest arose and said unto him, "Answerest thou nothing?" Up to this point, Jesus was just sitting there listening. He wasn't responding to anything that anybody said. So the high priest stands up and says, "Are you going to keep your mouth shut? Are you not going to speak up? Are you not going to defend yourself in some way? What is it which these witnesses against thee?" So he says, "What is it that these people have against you?" Well, of course, Jesus knew that this was corruption. He knew that they didn't have any legitimate charges against him. But they're placing it before him. You know, we've got all of these witnesses. All of them are coming forward saying that you've done all of these things. What do you have to say for yourself? Well, Jesus didn't have anything to say because he was innocent of all of these charges. There was nothing that they were laying before him and bringing up that he had done wrong. And so verse 63 says Jesus held his peace. He didn't say a word. You know, sometimes I think this world would be a lot better place if we learned to hold our peace more often. Sometimes it feels like we have to have an answer for everything, or we have to defend everything that comes along. Well, sometimes I think it would be better to follow this example of Jesus, and when it's not worth our breath, hold our peace. Hold our peace. Continuing on. And the high priest answered and said unto him, "I adjure thee by the living God that thou tell us whether thou be the Christ, the Son of God." So he says, I demand you, open your mouth, I demand you to answer this question. Are you the Christ? Are you this promised Messiah? Are you the Son of God?
Josh, he wasn't really asking him a question. If you notice, even in the King James, there's no question mark after that. It's more or less a statement. We want you to say it in front of the people so we can convict you of death.
That's right. That's right. They're still, even though they have found these two false witnesses that have come forward bringing somewhat plausible testimony, they're still trying to get Jesus to say something that's going to stir the people up, that's going to win their support of what the leaders are trying to do. Well, verse 64, Jesus speaks up and he says, "Thou hast said, nevertheless I say unto you, hereafter shall ye see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming in the clouds of heaven." So starting out, Jesus said, you spoke correctly. Yes, you're the one that said it. He says, but I tell you, he said, what's about to happen? He said, you're not going to see me here in the flesh anymore, because he knew what was going to happen. He knew what the culmination of this was. He said, you're not going to see me here in the flesh anymore. He said, because I'm about to ascend back into heaven. And then when mankind sees me again is when I come again. Going to be coming in the clouds. Well, of course, this was sheer blasphemy to the Jews. They didn't believe that he was the Son of God. They didn't genuinely, as David said, the high priest wasn't legitimately asking him this question. They were trying to get him to say something that would go along with the charges that they were trying to bring. Well, it was blasphemy to the Jews for anyone to claim to be the Son of God, to claim to be this promised Messiah, especially if it's someone that the priests and the scribes didn't accept. If your leaders don't accept it, then it can't be true. At least that was the mentality that they took. And so when the high priest heard this, as a display of the emotion that he felt, or the anger that he wanted the people to at least think he was feeling, it says that he tore his clothing. And oftentimes in that society, this is something that would be done for a couple of different reasons. One time when it would be a sign of grief. We read about people tearing their clothing and sitting in sackcloth and ashes in these times of tremendous grief. But also we see times of great anger. Times where people have allowed their emotions to overtake them. And they display this emotion by tearing their clothing. But the high priest, he rent his clothing, saying, "He hath spoken blasphemy." Now, if Jesus was not the Son of God, if he was not this promised Messiah, then what he said would be blasphemy. Well, they didn't accept him as the Son of God, and so to them, what he said was blasphemy. They said, "This man has spoken blasphemy. What further need have we of witnesses?" So going back to what David said, they don't need these witnesses anymore because now all of those in attendance have heard Jesus from his own lips speak what they believed to be blasphemy. That was all they needed. That was the only charge that they needed to be able to bring about this death sentence. It says, "Behold, we have heard his blasphemy." We've heard it from his own lips. "What think ye?" They answered and they said, "He is guilty of death." So going along with their system, blasphemy was something that was a crime that was worthy of death. And so they heard it. Their Jewish leaders opposed it. And so they said, well, then yes, he is worthy of death. We heard it from his own lips. Then did they spit in his face and buffeted him, and others smote him with the palms of their hands, saying, "Prophesy unto us, thou Christ. Who is he that smote thee?" So they're turning this into a game, this cruelty. They're coming along and they're spitting on him and they're slapping him and punching him, buffeting him, hitting him. And then they're coming back, "Well, if you really are who you say you are, then prophesy to us." And you picture this image, someone come up, slap Jesus and say, "Okay, tell me who hit you. Use your powers of prophecy. Tell us who it was that's been doing this to you." They were making a mockery of Jesus.
Tempting him.
Do what?
Tempting him.
Right. Right.
In this passage, he claims to be the Son of Man. He's claiming deity, and that's part of what they understood. Of course, he's answering the question about the Christ, the Son of God. But Son of Man, the expression, from Old Testament prophecy, is a claim for deity. One passage is Daniel 7:12-14. And when you read through that, he's claiming to be the one that is the Son of Man, who came with the clouds of heaven, came as the Ancient of Days, brought him near before him, and there was given him dominion, glory, a kingdom. All people, nations, languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away. His kingdom, that which shall not be destroyed. So, here's the prophecy of the everlasting kingdom going to be established by the King of Kings.
That's right.
And those that were the Jewish background, those priests, they would know that.
Absolutely.
And it would trigger, that's why he's ripping his clothes, because just that phrase and what he said would have triggered that to them. He's claiming to be the Ancient of Days.
That's right. That's right, because as you said, I mean, if you notice, the high priest didn't ask him if he was the Son of Man. He asked him, are you the Son of God? And then Jesus comes back and refers to himself in this way. And so, yes, that's an excellent point. Excellent point. All right, well, let's come back to Peter for just a moment. Where's Peter at when all this is taking place? He's out in the crowd. He's sitting there. He's watching, soaking all this in, listening to what people are saying, watching what they're doing to Jesus. He's sitting there. 69 says, Now Peter sat without in the palace, and a damsel, or a young lady, she came unto him, saying, Thou also was with Jesus of Galilee. So here's this young lady. Some translations, some of your more modern translations actually say, instead of damsel, they say little girl. So this could be a very, very young girl up to teenage that would fall under this heading. But you know, something that I see in this, as the father of a little girl, this is something I could see Kaylee doing. Hey, I know you. I saw you with Jesus. You know? And you know, it's this concept of perception that is there. All of these others that were there, had they been in those audiences before and heard Jesus preach and known the ones with him? I'm sure that many of them did. But they didn't see Peter sitting right there. But then this young lady, this little girl, she said, Hey, I know you. You were with Jesus. Well, of course, if she's like most other little girls, she probably didn't use an inside voice when she said this. And at least those that were around Jesus, or those that were around Peter, would have heard what she had to say. So I can imagine whenever they heard her say that, probably many of those eyes turned and looked at Peter. All right, Peter, what are you going to say? Are you going to do what you said you're going to do and stand up for Jesus and not back down, even if it means that you have to die? All of these eyes. But now remember, what has he just seen happen with Jesus? He's just been sentenced to death, or at least charged with a crime that they believed was worthy of death. He's sitting there watching them beat Jesus and spit on Jesus and mock Jesus. All right, Peter, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I'm sure there's some fear there. I'm sure there is. Verse 70 says, But he denied before them all, saying, I know not what thou sayest. No, you're wrong. No, I wasn't with Jesus. You don't know what you're talking about. I have no clue what you're saying. No, I wasn't with Jesus. Well, keep in mind, remember, Jesus told Peter, he said, before morning comes or before the cock crows, he says, you're going to deny me 3 times. Well, here's one time. One time already has taken place. And when he was gone out into the porch, another maid, once again, another young woman, she saw him and said unto them that were there, This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth. You know, it's always been amazing to me that as well known in that community as Jesus was, And with all of the attention that he had been receiving in this week leading up to his death, that no one other than these young ladies picked Peter out of that crowd. One of Jesus' inner circle that was with him basically at all times. But again, it goes back to that concept of perception. And I think most of us would understand this fact. I mean, it's been a proven scientific fact that this quality of perception, this trait of perception, is something that most of the time is deeper with women. You know, I could look at a picture for 5 minutes and I might be able to tell you one or two things about it. You let my wife look at that picture, or you let Kaylee look at that picture, and they can describe every minute detail of the thing. It's those qualities of perception. And this is something that I think is contributing to the fact that it was these young women that was noticing Peter and picking Peter out. Well, Peter, when he has been spotted this first time there, when he's in the courts, he gets up. He goes out into the porch, out into the courtyard. He leaves this mob behind, trying to get further away. Well, he gets out there, and guess who he runs into? He runs into another young woman. Hey, I know you. You were with Jesus. And his response again, no. You don't know what you're talking about. You're mistaking me for somebody else. Notice 72 says, and he denied it with an oath. I do not know the man. Yeah, he says, I promise you, I swear to you, I don't know this man. Now, in that society, that culture, something like that held a lot more weight than it does today. You know, those are words that people use very flippantly today. But in those days, when you actually made a promise or you swore to something, oftentimes that was legally binding. You could be committing a crime if you broke those promises or those oaths that you made. So here he says, no, I promise you, I don't know this man. I'm not the one that was with him. And then after a while came unto him they that stood by, and said to Peter, surely thou also art one of them, for thy speech bewrayeth thee, or maketh thee known. Peter was there trying to blend in. And literally what this passage is saying, it says, you know, your dialect, the way that you talk, you're not from around here. I'm sure any of us that have grown up here in rural northeast Arkansas, if you've traveled very far away, someone's probably made that statement to you before. You're not from around here, are you? We have different dialects from different areas that we're from. Well, where was Peter from? Was Peter raised in Jerusalem? No. So he would not have spoken in the same way, or at least with the same dialect, as those Jews that were assembled there. And so here you had some men, and they had been observing Peter. They had been listening. They'd been questioning. I can hear the conversation. Are you sure that's who that is? Well, I think that's who it is. Are you sure? Well, they come to him and they say, well, we've been listening to what you have to say, and we know you're not one of us. We know that you're not from around here. Now, we've been going back and forth on whether you really are one of Jesus' followers, but when we heard you talk, there's no denying it. We know who you are. Well, whenever they said this, Peter began to curse. He began to swear. Began to conduct himself in a way that he really didn't need to, in a way that was not befitting a disciple of Christ. He began to curse and swear, saying, I know not the man. I don't know Jesus. How many times do I have to tell you? I don't know him. I'm not who you say that you are. And immediately when those words exited his mouth, what happened? Uh-oh. The rooster crowed.
Do you wonder why he even was there in the first place? Why was he there?
Well, the text says that he was there because he wanted to see what was going to happen. He wanted to see the end of the matter. Peter wanted to know how all this was going to transpire, because remember, we've talked in the past about the fact that all this time, the disciples really didn't believe that Jesus was going to die. They were accepting him like Adam was saying, this is the Son of God. This is deity. How can man put deity to death? And I believe that Peter was there because he wanted to see exactly what was going to transpire, what the end of the matter was going to be. And so he stuck around.
Because of that we today, a lot of people want to really put all the blame on Peter, but the other disciples, other followers, the other apostles, they had already left Jesus. They'd already head out of Dodge, so to speak.
Right, they got as far away as they could.
I look at it the other way. At least Peter was concerned enough that he was still there. Maybe there was hope in his heart that it wouldn't happen. But yeah, he denied Christ, and I don't know if any of us would. I wonder how many of us would have been strong enough to stand up and claim that. When the story just kind of drops off there, but we don't. If they were going to put Peter to death too, where would we have been?
I feel sorry for Peter because he was hurting. I mean, it shows that he was at the end.
Right.
He cried and cried.
Well, it was kind of a hopeless position that he was in.
I mean, it had to happen. Jesus
Right.
said it was happening.
Right. But then they were talking about things and dealing with things that was so foreign to the reality that they were used to. And, they had never been in the presence of deity. They had never, and all of these concepts were ones that they struggled to understand. And that's why we see Jesus many times having to address these same matters over and over, because it was hard for them to wrap their minds around certain concepts. And this is one of those. But nevertheless, Peter told Jesus, he says, I'm never going to deny you. I'm never going to leave you. Jesus says, well, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. Well, he denies Jesus the 3rd time. As soon as he says it, a rooster crowed. Immediately, the realization of what he had done settled in. He remembered what Jesus had said. He went out and he wept bitterly. He was sad because he had fallen prey to what he said he would never do.
And he was the strong one of the bunch.
He was always the
protector.
right. He was very much so the alpha. I mean, he was the one that was so often seen in the forefront of the group. And even whenever we come into the early days of the church, who was the one that was often seen as the spokesman or the one out in the front most of the time, at least in the early days? It was Peter.
I would imagine he felt probably how Judas felt. Judas went out and wept bitterly hung himself. And Peter, I felt like he betrayed Christ. I think same feeling.
Right. Well, and one thing, and we are out of time, but one thing that we will discuss later on, the difference that we see in Peter and Judas. Peter was willing to move past what he had done wrong. He was willing to repent and to correct what he had done wrong. Judas, he felt like his only option was to end his life. And so even though essentially in a way they had done the same thing, I mean, Peter denied him verbally, and Judas had denied him and forsaken him in a physical sense. But nevertheless, it shows that we need to be very cautious in the things that we say that we will do or won't ever do. Because here was Peter, and he believed that he would never deny Christ. The other disciples there, they believed they would never deny Christ. But then when he did, and that reality sank in, he understood. He said, yeah. I think we do. And so often, and I think we addressed this a little bit last week. Y'all come on in. We're just still talking a little bit. Y'all come on in. But, how many times have we found ourselves after we've given in to a temptation, sitting there thinking to ourselves or beating ourselves up saying, I never thought I would do this. I never thought that I would succumb to this. And it kind of goes hand in hand with what we're seeing here with Peter. It is. All right, well, we're going to stop right there.